Hi everyone, welcome back to the Book Review Corner. In today's video, we're going to talk about A Kingdom of Their Own, the story of the Palmers of Glen Erie by Stephen J. May. This book is a story of General William Palmer, his wife Queen Palmer, and their daughters Dorothy, Elise, and Marjorie. If you've been around Colorado Springs for any measure of time, you may be familiar with Palmer High School, or the Palmer Center in front of the Antlers, or even Palmer Park. You might have heard stories of William or Queen Palmer around the city, as I have from growing up here. But what I really liked about the book is it took a very broad and very sweeping view of the entire family and gave a lot of insight into their lives. The Palmers not only founded Colorado Springs and made it into a thriving city, but they really did create a kingdom out of this city. I'll illustrate more specifically what I mean by that, but before we do that, I wanted to give a major point that I took away from this book. My main takeaway from the book is that creating a kingdom takes grit, hardship, and time. Let's take a minute to break down each of those three parts, beginning with grit. Before the city of Colorado Springs was founded, and even before Colorado became a state in the Union, this area was a collection of mountains, hills, and prairies. The place where Colorado Springs now sits was at one point a buffalo hunting grounds for the Ute Native Americans. It was a pretty cold place with very short brown grass and very limited shrubs throughout the region. It wasn't the treed city that we now know of. Also, being at the foot of Pikes Peak, it was a particularly barren area that wasn't good for growing crops. Random hailstorms would come up in the middle of May, sometimes later, and destroy anything that was trying to grow. This fact has remained true to this day. In fact, just last year we had a late snowstorm, and a few years ago we had a big, heavy snowstorm in late May. Now I say creating a kingdom takes grit, not only because the area of Colorado Springs was a difficult place to start a town, but also because the people, General William Palmer and Queen Palmer, had a certain measure of grit to make it in the beginning. General Palmer was a young man of 28 who had quickly risen through the ranks. During the Civil War, he led a troop of Pennsylvanian soldiers who pushed towards the south along the East Coast. At one point, while he was a captain, he spent some time as a spy, was captured, and interned in one of the major prisons of the time in Richmond, Virginia. Despite his youth, General Palmer rose through the ranks quite quickly because of his character and because of the respect that he instilled in his troops. He understood the horrors of war and bloodshed from a first-hand perspective, and I think that served him well as he entered the railroad business. After the Civil War, Queen and Will met and were married, and not long after that, during one of Will's surveys, he discovered an area that would be known as Colorado Springs in the near future. Will had a vision for this seemingly desolate area that really drove him and enabled him to build something out of nothing. But even more than that, it took grit from Queen, who, moving from the East Coast, discovered a dry and barren land, very much different from the green and lush rolling hills of springtime in the East Coast. She found a dry and barren area in the middle of April in Colorado Springs, or what would be known as Colorado Springs. Nevertheless, Queen took her husband's desires to live in this place and start this city in stride. She, along with some of their extended family, moved to the city of Colorado Springs before Will had even finished the Glen Erie Castle, which would later be their home. They spent the first few months living in tents, in people's cabins, and barns, until the Glen was finally finished. From laying out city streets and inviting people to come to the city, and dealing with people who, when they arrived at the city, discovered a dirt town and were quite frustrated at the people who were writing the notes in the journals saying, "Come to Colorado Springs." In the midst of dealing with all of that, as well as creating their own home, it required a lot of grit out of the Palmers to really make this not only their home, but their kingdom. And this takes me to my second point. Creating a kingdom requires a level of hardship. In the West, there were a lot of wars. Some of those wars are pretty familiar, such as the Civil War or the war between the Native Americans and the colonials. But there were also wars for laying railroad ties. And these wars weren't just wars on paper. General Palmer and his railroad troop wanted to build a railroad from Colorado all the way down through Mexico City. While the whole route was not fully realized, there was a lot of building that he was able to do over the course of his time in Colorado. During this time, there were two instances that really exemplify the hardship of building a railroad in the Wild West. The first was building a railroad through Raton Pass in the southern Colorado, northern New Mexico border. A rival railroad company set up camp early and was able to secure a contract to build a railroad through the southern part of the state before William Palmer's crew was even able to get there. Recognizing that this opposing railroad company had taken over the Raton Pass and that if they had gone into a fight they would have lost a few members of their troop, General Palmer instead decided to turn his attention to the Royal Gorge, specifically leading to Leadville. While the opposing railroad company built their train tracks through Raton Pass, General Palmer and his crew set up camp building the trail through the Royal Gorge. Before long, that same opposing railroad troop came around to the Royal Gorge and started a war. The two opposing railroad camps shot at each other and hurled rocks at each other until the whole matter was able to be settled in court. In the end, General Palmer's railroad crew won the rights to build the railroad through the Royal Gorge. Even when the agreements were signed and the railroad was completed, the Palmers weren't out of the weeds yet. During a train ride through the Royal Gorge to Leadville and returning back to Colorado Springs, Queen Palmer experienced a heart attack. Queen had experienced other health scares before this moment, but after having the heart attack, her physicians advised her that living at a high altitude wasn't good for her health. She made the painstaking decision to move out of Colorado and the beautiful home that they had built in the Glen. Queen, along with the Palmer daughters, Elise, Dorothy, and Marjorie, moved out of Colorado and eventually settled in Kent, England. This was the last time Queen would live in Colorado, though they might not have known that at the time. Will would remain in the States to run his railroad business and occasionally travel across the ocean to visit Queen and his daughters. Being across an ocean back in the day was really difficult because it took a long time to travel. And when Queen eventually fell ill, it took so long for Will to finally get to England that she had passed before he arrived. After the funeral, his three daughters moved back with him to Colorado and to Glen Eyrie. It was an adjustment for his daughters moving back into the house with him, since he was very much a military type. But they endured through the season and continued to help the city of Colorado Springs grow. The final hardship that I'll mention is that General Palmer loved riding on horses for a long time. It was a sense of freedom, and it enabled him to really explore the area known as Queens Canyon around his castle at Glen Eyrie, as well as the entire Colorado Springs area. He loved being outside. One day, around the age of 80, his horse tripped. He was flown off the saddle, and he broke his neck, which paralyzed him from the waist down. He had limited motion in his arms and limited motion in his head from that point forward. Nevertheless, he still contended for the city of Colorado Springs. And this leads me to my final takeaway, that a kingdom takes time to build. General Palmer spent the majority of his life making Colorado Springs not only a town, but a city that people could call home and really invite others to. It took decades, but by the time General Palmer was an old man, the Antlers had not only been built twice, but it also faced other fancy hotels in the downtown Colorado Springs area. Colorado College had been built and had recruited several professors to teach and create a great learning environment for everyone who wanted to come to the state. And in the midst of tuberculosis across the country, Colorado Springs had become a haven for a lot of patients. General Palmer was respected and beloved by people, whether it was on the railroad or in the army or just in the city of Colorado Springs. He was known for employing older people who might not have had a job otherwise, just so that they would have the money to afford food and shelter. Even before all that, while Queen was still at Glen Eyrie, the castle at Glen Eyrie often hosted a lot of their friends that were moving to town and helped them get their feet. When General Palmer died, Elise and Dorothy moved back to England. Marjorie stayed in the city of Colorado Springs with her husband, Dr. Watt. She financed sanatoriums and remained in Colorado until her husband died. When he eventually died and World War I came about, she joined her sisters in England. Even though the Palmers left Colorado, their indelible mark on the city of Colorado Springs remained. They created a kingdom, complete with a castle, and made it their home. Now, there's a lot more to the story of the Palmers of Glen Eyrie than I was able to share in this video, so I'd encourage you to check out the book if you haven't already. And if you're interested, Glen Eyrie Castle is now owned by the Navigators, and they host daily tours and oftentimes afternoon teas if you'd like to go and visit. But with that said, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a big thumbs up. And if you haven't done so already, subscribe down below. And I will see you in the next video. Totally.